Hey, everybody. Welcome into the podcast. We are back with another special bonus episode. Today, Brad and I are going to be highlighting a brand that we think has a really cool and unique approach to making whiskey, and that brand is called Broken Barrel. Broken Barrel Whiskey Company is based out of Los Angeles, California. They're part of a larger company called Infuse Spirits. We're actually going to sit down with the owner of the company, Seth, in just a minute here, and he's going to kind of break down the company and what they do. But before we get there, Brad, had you heard of Broken Barrel before these samples that they sent us arrived on your doorstep?
No, I really hadn't. And I will say I'm glad that you just offered up his first name. Like, the CEO, runner, founder, owner of this company, Bill.
Right. Actually, Bill. He just goes by Seth. It's like Madonna or Prince.
Oh, okay.
He wants everyone to just know him as Seth.
The whiskey distiller formerly known as Seth.
Yeah, so Broken Barrel, I found out about them through our Instagram account because what came out in the course of the interview was that they've actually really, really invested in kind of doing grassroots type advertising. And so they sponsor some people on Instagram, and it worked on me. Like, I've seen their bottles all over the place, and I really wanted to try them. And what we came to
so how much are we getting paid for this, Bob?
$1 million, Brad.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, finally.
Cool.
We
Awesome.
hit the big time. So what I love about the way that they do business is it's not like some of the whiskeys we've had on the show, Brad, that do like the rapid aging technique where, you make a whiskey and it technically has to be aged for, an undisclosed amount of time. So they put it in a big vat and they throw some wood chips in there and they, kind of blend it all together and add some suction. And then after 20 minutes, they say, all right, it's aged whiskey now. That whiskey never comes out very good because you can always tell a young whiskey when you're drinking it. Instead of doing it that way, what they do is they buy aged whiskey. They source it from a distillery in Owensboro, Kentucky. They ship it out to California. And what they do is they buy, empty barrels that were used for other purposes, like wine barrels, sherry casks. Instead of just finishing it in those casks, they break down the barrels. They submerge the broken bits of barrel in a tank with the whiskey so that it actually extracts even more from those barrels. And then after, they've determined that it's soaked for long enough, they drain it, they empty it, and then they bottle it. So it's not a rapid aging technique as much as it's like a rapid finishing technique, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm just still confused. Why do they call it Broken Barrel, Bob?
I know.
I don't understand.
It's so cryptic.
It's a really interesting name. I wish I could figure it out.
I already have to correct myself because it's not even really a rapid finishing technique. They do it for as long as some of these other companies are finishing, but they borrow that principle of kind of like submerging the barrel in the liquid as opposed to, filling the barrel with the liquid. So, Brad, I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about this company. What do you say we go ahead and throw over to my interview with Seth, the artist formerly known as Seth, right now?
I'm genuinely curious at this point. Does Seth have a last name?
Let's find out together.
Let's get to it.
All right, so I am joined today by Seth Benheim from Broken Barrel Whiskey. Seth, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, man. We were talking with, I think, like your marketing rep at Broken Barrel and trying to set this up, and they said, listen, Seth just had a baby. He probably doesn't want to do it in the morning on your time because we're East Coast, you're West Coast. And I was like, please don't make this man wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning to do an interview with us. I know those hours of sleep are precious.
Yes, they are.
Well, Seth, we're really happy to have you on the show today. Hopefully we get a chance to talk just a little bit about maybe your favorite movie or something before we get you out of here as well. But we're here to talk about the product, Broken Barrel. I have seen this all over the place, especially on Instagram. And looking at your website, it seems like you guys have really leaned heavily into the social media influencers as a way to do some kind of grassroots viral marketing as well. So maybe even before we get into talking about the brand itself, can you just give us like 30 seconds on why you guys have chosen to lean into social media so heavily?
I think for the very reason you just described. I mean, you're seeing it, and so it's working. That's kind of, the idea. And it's cheap. It's much cheaper than working, you could do a billboard or a magazine ad or a television ad or a radio ad. My favorite things are things you can do, while you're sitting on the toilet or or driving in the car, or right now, I'm at my desk at work, and I'm being somewhat, facetious about that, but no, literally, I mean, we're a small company. We don't have an internal marketing team. I've got Mike Bilowski, who handled a lot of our events at our facility in Los Angeles, and he also handles a lot of our outside, experiential type events. But we all wear a lot of hats. I handle the Broken Barrel Instagram account, and we kind of divide and conquer. And literally, I kid you not, we all do a little bit of everything.
Well, I have to say that the social media aspect and using the influencers the way you guys do, I mean, you're right. It worked on me. It's part of why I decided to reach out and see if we could get an interview set up with you guys. The brand is just like, I feel like it's exploding. Can you just give us a little bit of a history of the brand itself? I know it grew out of this company, Infused Spirits, but what sets it apart from the rest of what you guys are doing at Infuse?
Well, I think the easiest way to understand it is we do a vodka that is made with real fruits, and they're inside the bottle, the fruits. So we call that like a single bottle infusion. Like, there's a lot of single this, single that terms, like single barrel or single malt or single cask or none. So we are single bottle infusions, and Broken Barrel is not that. And so it doesn't really fit in the Infuse family. Everything's done in tanks, it's done in batches, and the brand really came out under the Infuse banner in 2017, but by 2019, we had released the Single Oak series under the Broken Barrel flag, and we went full grain to glass Kentucky bourbon and rye by 2020 with our partners in Owensboro, Kentucky, and their phenomenal distillery. And this year, 2021, Broken Barrel is going to have its own custom bottle, its own custom label. So that's all in the works. And hopefully by the end of this year, people will really have their hands on a truly unique looking, tasting, feeling product that stands alone and on its own.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the process itself. I'm really interested. I love that you've just named the company after the process. It makes it a lot easier to explain. But I know that what you are essentially doing is you're breaking barrel staves and you are putting them directly into the fluid so that it is in some ways kind of an infused thing, but on a vat level as opposed to a bottle level. My question then is, we've had a couple companies on the show that are big into this kind of rapid aging process that we see sometimes. And I think for our listeners, it might be helpful if you could distinguish what you guys are doing with the kind of barrel stave finishes as opposed to what we see with some of these more proprietary, like rapid aging processes.
Yeah, it's not rapid. I think rapid aging is the wrong terminology for what we do.
Right.
And, you wouldn't take, just like you wouldn't call a 5 or 8 or 10-year-old bourbon rapid age because they put a stave or finish it in a barrel. These staves it's way more akin to a flavor addition than it is to an age process. I mean, yes, there's a ton of surface area on a stave of oak that interacts with the whiskey, but it's not an aging technique as much as it is a flavoring technique. I've come to the description of whiskey. When I think of whiskey, I think of flavor and feel, right? There's the two kind of components. Like, what does it taste like? And what experience is your mouth undergoing? Your gums, your teeth, your tongue, the roof of your mouth as you swallow it. And the flavor is really settled in from that oak. And when you use different oaks, like a Sauterne cask or a Amontillado cask, Mizunara, an ex tequila barrel, an ex wine barrel, this, that, you're going to get flavor. But those things, especially if they're not used over the course of, say, years and years and years, they're not going to change that mouthfeel too dramatically. Mouthfeel comes from age and time. And I really have not found too many rapid aged or chemically or scientifically processed whiskeys that are able to replicate the feel of an older whiskey. Feel versus flavor. That's kind of where I'd leave people in terms of how they think of whiskey. And Broken Barrel, it's younger whiskey. and it's delicious because it's got a whole bunch of extra sort of flavor from a combination of different oak staves that kind of take your mouth on a bit of a roller coaster ride as you drink it. But it's just old enough that it has that backbone you need and want, but not too old that it's going to cost you an arm and a leg.
Yeah, and again, I hope I didn't imply that you guys were part of the rapid aging process, because I think that's what I want to distinguish here is how you're different. And I think that you've really carved out a unique niche in the market, because it is more of a finishing process, and yet like it uses some of those principles of actually, you know, submerging the wood in the product that you see in those kind of rapid age products. But what I love about it is that it doesn't taste like it is a day old, which I think a lot of those rapid aged products, they still carry that youth and youngness in the mouthfeel as well. So I'm so glad you were able to, to distinguish that, because Broken Barrel is a completely different beast in itself.
The biggest problem we don't want to run into is for people to spend $50, $60, $70 on our whiskey and feel like it tastes a day old.
Yeah.
That would be the death of any craft whiskey brand. And I think it has been sort of a red flag on a lot of the industry, is people needing the cash or needing to release a whiskey that was really, really young, and for it to not have the right components. And then based on the costs of things, to charge really, as the smaller the production, the more expensive the materials and inputs. And so it can get really expensive for young whiskey, and not all of it necessarily was ready to go out. So that's a problem people have. We charge $29 for a bottle of whiskey. It's not, we're priced next to really big companies like Redemption and Bullet and Maker's Mark and, legacy, Kentucky and corporate brands that just don't, you don't see a lot of craft in our price range. And that's one of the major differences. And we feel like we're priced accordingly given the age of our whiskey, but that also doesn't mean that it's going to taste like, a 2-day-old whiskey or any of that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. And if anyone who listens to our podcast knows that we value here at the podcast, when we review whiskeys, we add a fifth category. We usually do, nose, taste, finish, balance, but we add value in because the average consumer out there really wants to know, am I getting my money's worth in this market that is absolutely booming right now? So to see the price that you guys are selling it at, to see that it's not 2-day-old whiskey and that you're taking the time to do these finishes, it really is, I think, one of the better values that we've found in the craft spirits world. So when you guys were first kind of experimenting with and forming this offshoot, I guess, if you want to call it that, from infused spirits, I mean, did you foresee like how hands-on this was going to have to be as opposed to what you were doing with the vodkas and the gins? Yeah,
100%. Like we put fruit down the neck of a bottle, so we're no strangers to manual labor.
Well, that's what I'm saying, though. I mean, it sounds like this takes just a ton more quality control and constant sampling to see like when, it's reached the point that it's not getting overdone. And I imagine that has to be much more labor intensive than what was going on with the vodka and stuff. So like how much of a learning curve has that been?
Tremendous learning curve. I think as my palate improves, as most people in the industry would say, once you've tasted X amount, your palate is like a muscle. You have to work it out. And so the more you taste and the more you go, oh man, I really like what they did here with this product or what these guys did with that product, you arrive at a point where you're like, this is the kind of way I want this whiskey to taste. And so I'm more confident now in the whiskey we produce than ever before, especially 4 years ago. I mean, 4 years ago, I was 28, you don't know what you don't know back then. And so, yeah, we put out whiskey, and at the time we liked it and we still think highly of it, but I don't think it quite compares to the whiskey we're putting out now. And I think that's true. There's a special place in your heart for batch 1, but I can safely say that batch 12 is just way better. And I'm talking about our small batch bourbon. Batch 12 is just so much better than batch 1 or 2. We got better at it. We improved for sure.
I mean, kind of along those lines, we've had quite a few distillers on the show now talking about the current boom that we're in with whiskey and with bourbon in particular, and just how even with their best planning, they really couldn't have predicted that customers would be as, voracious with their appetite for bourbon as we're seeing right now. So as the company's grown, like, what's it been like to try to catch up to demand overall in the industry? And then also, doing what you guys are doing and sourcing your whiskey and trying to make sure that relationship stays on track so that you don't run out of product to keep finishing. How's that aspect of the business come along?
There's a lot of, we got to make sure we create recipes that are sustainable. So if we have something special, like we don't put out an everyday peach brandy cask finish, because I'm not necessarily sure I can always, without fail, get the same kind and type and quality of a peach brandy from the same producer, let's say. So that's a little bit harder. Whereas, like, I know I can always get French oak, I can always get ex-bourbon barrels, and I can always get, domestic sherry casks or Cabernet wine from California. That's not as worrisome. So we try to make sure that when we create a product or an expression of whiskey, that the inputs for the core stuff are widely available, and the inputs for the specialty stuff, we know that it may run out one day and we'll have to pull that product and be ready to replace it with something else if we decide to. So those considerations happen. Keeping up with demand is one thing. I think funding it and having the capital to do that is another thing. And so it's not a capacity constraint. Our partners in Owensboro, Kentucky, there's no issue with them. They have enough whiskey to meet whatever we think we can sell. That they're quite well stocked. Mm-hmm. It would seem. It's us having enough money to pay for all of it is up front is the problem. So that's a bigger issue than say capacity. I think capacity is for us, at least, because we're not the distillery, right? That's a different situation.
Sure.
So we're not worrying about grain shortage for ourselves per se. We're buying aged whiskey that's already been barreled and distilled and all that. So that's a different sort of way of thinking about capacity and supply than maybe a distillery.
Sure. All right, Seth, I'm going to get you off the hot seat here. I don't mean to grill you so much.
No, it's okay.
But let's shift gears here. So you are, you're currently a guest on the Film and Whiskey podcast. And when we bring distillers, CEOs, heads of businesses on, we never let them go without talking at least briefly about their favorite movie. But before we let you go, I want to hear like your 30-second elevator pitch. What's your favorite movie and why does it deserve to be talked about on the Film and Whiskey podcast?
Oh, God. I wish I should have I should have asked if that question was coming or a question like that. I'll just say one of my favorite movies. I really liked The Dark Knight. I thought that one film in particular was pretty perfect. I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, we did an episode on The Dark Knight, I think last season. And no matter how many times you watch that movie, it never loses its power. It never loses its ability to wow you. Honestly, I think for me,
a different one. I can give you a different movie if you want. That's one of my favorite movies. Probably my favorite. If you're gonna talk about all superhero movies ever, I think that one's definitely the best.
Absolutely.
That or Watchmen. I enjoyed Watchmen. I know other people didn't, but I did.
Where are you landing on the Snyder Cut?
It was long.
Yeah,
really long.
It was really long.
It's funny. You think that movie's long because it's like 4 hours, but you just as easily will sit and watch an entire series of a TV show and spend 6 hours on the couch on a Sunday afternoon, like it's nothing. So it's all relative.
Absolutely.
But no, I liked. I enjoyed Watchmen. I thought Watchmen was fantastic. Both the show and the movie were great. So my favorite Zack Snyder piece would be Watchmen.
Well, listen, when we take our deep dive into the Snyderverse, you will be our first call to talk about Watchmen. I can't wait to talk about that, man.
You are in luck. I don't want to say I know a lot about movies, but I definitely have a lot of thoughts about movies. And back in the day, I had all the Tarantino posters in my room when I was in high school. And I remember my dad and I went to go see Kill Bill, and he was like, "Oh shit, I don't know if I should have taken my kid to see it." But at one point in time, long before I was into alcohol, I was definitely into film and made movies with friends in high school and all that. So we were into it.
Well, everybody, this has been Seth Benheim from Broken Barrel Whiskey. We're going to throw over to Brad and me trying the whiskey now, giving it a full review. But once again, Seth, thank you so much for joining us today on Film and Whiskey.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
All right, so that was our interview with CEO Seth Benheim of Broken Barrel. Brad, you did find out that he has a last name after all, so I'm sorry to burst your bubble there.
Yeah, it's disappointing, man. I was really just hoping for a Seth.
Now, as we get into trying these whiskeys, Brad and I have talked about like how we want to approach this. I think the best way to go about it, Brad, and Broken Barrel was not stingy with sharing samples with us. They sent each of us 5 samples to try of their line of products. So we have 5 whiskeys to drink through, to review. I think we should just kind of give, general tasting notes on each of these, Brad, and then maybe at the end, let's kind of do our own personal rankings of where these fall for us. How's that sound?
Yeah, it sounds great. And I feel like, they sent us proofs. It was 88, 95, 105, 110, 115. I just feel like it'd be really easy to go through proof by proof. I mean, that's how I tried them. Seems like an easy way to do it, Bob, don't you think?
Actually, Brad, I disagree. I tried them in a different order, and we can try them in whatever order you want. But they do go out of proof order, but that's because some of them are finished in certain types of barrels. So like the 88 proof one is actually finished with Cabernet barrels. So, I mean, if you want to start there, we can. I just kind of worry that if we try like a wine finished one first, it might throw off our palate a little bit for trying the ones that aren't finished in, non-bourbon barrels.
Yeah, sure, Bob. Whatever you want. It is all up to you, man.
I'll tell you what. Let's just do this. Let's try the standard bourbon first. This is a 95 proof whiskey, and then after this one, I'll let you call whatever order you want to go in after this. So, I want to try like their regular baseline offering, which again is a 95 proof. The mash bill on the sourced whiskey that they used is 70% corn, 21 rye, 9 barley. And then the cool thing about, Broken Barrel, which you heard in the interview, is they do this kind of oak bill thing where they use different kinds of barrels and they talk about what barrels they used. So they used ex-bourbon barrels, ex-French oak barrels, and sherry cask barrels to finish this one. So, Brad, let's try this 95 proof. What are you picking up here on the nose?
As I get into this 95 proof, I feel like it has a bit of a young nose. There's a little bit of vanilla sweetness to it, but there's not a massive amount going on here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. This one, if you look at the label, and each of the labels are slightly different, so you really do have to read here. It says that the bourbon in this one is aged for a minimum of 1 year. So this is really, really young whiskey. Most of it's 2-year whiskey, but this one, is some sort of a blend that only has 1-year whiskey in it as well. And I think that at a certain point, you just can't cover up the smell of young whiskey. And so this one definitely smells young, but it has some nice caramel notes. It has some nice butterscotch. That was actually the thing that stood out to me the most was it has a butterscotchy kind of nose to me. But I'm with you, man. A little bit young. When it comes to the taste, it definitely has like a thinner mouthfeel. But I think what's going to become a theme here today, at least for me, is that the process they use at Broken Barrel, they take young whiskey and they make it taste not young. And that's kind of what Seth was talking about. Like for him, he can always tell a young whiskey by the mouthfeel. And so, even though this might smell younger, it really does kind of smooth some of those harsher edges off of what you normally taste when you're tasting a younger whiskey. This one, it was really spicy. There was lots of oak here. It tastes older than it is. And I think that's one of the biggest compliments I can give it.
I think that with a lot of young whiskeys, they might have something somewhat flavorful at the start, but it usually all falls apart on the finish, right? That like these young whiskeys, it just almost turns into like a pine sol type finish where it's just kind of harsh. And I think that for them, whatever the heck they're doing, it takes the edge off the finish. And I really noticed that here on their 95, proof basic offering. That for me, this was much better at the end of the experience than it was at the start. Mm-hmm. And like, that's a pretty big compliment for a really young whiskey.
Yeah, totally agree. All right, man, where do you want to go from here? I'll let you call the shots.
I think that we should go on over to the 105 proof. I mean, that's just next in order. It's their small batch version. So why don't we go over there?
Yeah, so this is actually their rye. So all 4 of the other ones are bourbons. This one is a rye. So we're just going to go ahead and make the jump to rye now. This rye was also aged a minimum of 1 year. So this is very young rye. 95% rye mash bill with 5% malted barley. And then the oak bill that they finished this with, 40% ex-bourbon, 40% French oak, 20% sherry. So the exact same that we had in that bourbon. I'm interested to see how the rye, is similar and different from that 95 proof bourbon. Brad, what do you think?
As I get into this one, it's once again, it's young. Like there's no masking the youth of this whiskey. For me, though, it had some nice apple notes. There's a little bit of rye spice here. It's just as smooth as the first one, which, once again, is a massive compliment for a really young whiskey. Honestly, overall, I think this is a little bit of a step up. The mouthfeel is a little more engaging than our first one. I think it's a fine, solid addition into your rye cabinet if you're willing to pay a little more for a young whiskey.
Yeah, so I actually differ from you a lot on this one. I'm kind of glad we're knocking this one out now because of the 5, this was probably my least favorite one. I think this one really goes back to smelling young. And again, it's a 1 year rye. I know that when we've talked to some distillers, they say that rye tends to mature faster than corn, than a bourbon would. But here, I think the youngness, the youth of this rye really stands out. There's a lot of toffee on the nose for me. And I get a little bit of that apple that you're talking about, Brad, but this one tastes younger than all of the rest of them for me. I think it brings that spiciness that you want in a rye. It doesn't taste harsh. But I think this was the one that they kind of had the hardest time, masking the youth of this. I think I'd probably use this more as a mixer than I would drinking it neat. So for me, and I hate to kind of spoil my ranking here so early, I think this is the one that I liked the least out of all 5.
I'm close there with you. I'm not going to give all my rankings yet, but it's definitely not in the top 1 or 2.
Well, at least we agree on that. So, let's jump over to one of these other ones because it sounds like we're really going to go up from here. Where do you want to go next?
Yeah, let's jump on over to the finished, and we'll start with the 88 proof. You notice that, first off, this is their lowest proof whiskey that they offer.
Mm-hmm.
The mash bill here is a 70% corn mash bill, 21% rye, and 9% malted barley. So you're definitely getting a sweeter side of things here with that high corn mash bill. And then in the casks that they're throwing in there, it's 80% ex-bourbon Cabernet casks, and a little bit of 20% French oak.
Yeah, so this kind of falls into that classic, wine finished category here. And this one was also aged a little bit longer. The whiskey in this is a minimum of 2 years. And I think it really shows. There's not much going on the nose. If I could ding this in any category, there's very little on the nose here. It reminds me of fresh red grapes right off the vine. It's really, really fresh and bright, but it doesn't smell like wine. And I think that was something that kind of threw me because usually you get a pretty intense wine character with some of these Cabernet finished bourbons.
Yeah, Bob, for me, I get into this one and I get just really nice cherry notes with a little bit of creaminess. It is very smooth, very pleasant. And honestly, of the 3 we've tried so far, this is the first one that I drink and I go, oh, this doesn't taste like young whiskey.
Yeah.
This is one where I was impressed with the quality of whiskey as well as the flavors and everything else that was going on. So I actually found myself to be a pretty big fan of this stuff.
Yeah, this was one that I wrote down, my note was well-rounded on this one. It really does it tastes like a cohesive experience when you're drinking it. Much smoother of a sipper than the 95 proof bourbon was for me. And again, it is a few steps down in proof, but it's not that it tastes more watery. It tastes to me, it's just a better whiskey all around. Really nice round vanilla notes, a nice little bit of rye spice on the back of the palate. I like this one a lot, Brad. This might actually be my favorite one of all 5.
Yeah, this is one that I am highly impressed with. I think that, I guess if I spoil a little bit of my scores, I think that the 95 and 105 are in a different lower category than their 88 proof, 110 and 116.
Yeah, for sure. let's move over to this cask of Amontillado. And I absolutely love the Edgar Allan Poe reference here. But again, go ahead.
I was going to say, Bob, the cask of Amontillado, I remember in high school when we were forced to read Edgar Allan Poe, like, you know, you have some of the poems and short stories that are fine, but the Cask of Amontillado, I don't know why, but as a freshman in high school, I freaking loved that story.
Oh yeah, man.
So to like see a reference to that in the whiskey world, I was just like really, really pumped about that.
Yeah, I mean, so this one, it seems like this is their kind of special edition if they have one. This is a blend of 12-year whiskey, which they say is finished with 5-year Kentucky corn whiskey. So the crazy thing is, on these little samples that we have, this is the only one that they don't include like the exact mash bill of. So we're winging it a little bit here when it comes to sipping this one. But Brad, I have to say, the step up in proof is definitely noticeable here. This one, we just jumped from 88 proof to 110 proof. And at the same time, you really get a difference on the nose here in a way that we haven't had before. This is much more herbal on the nose. I kind of wrote down the word prickly. It reminded me a lot of when we tried that Found North rye and they finished it in Hungarian oak barrels. Like there's just something that is very kind of woodsy about this one.
Yeah, there is some beautiful oak notes going on here. I think that as I get into the actual palate and finish, that it is smooth. It's got this nice dark, like dry Cabernet type feel to it. It's like a dark fruitiness that pairs with the oak. It's got that nice dry finish that I'm looking for with like a well-aged red wine. I really actually like this one a lot. And once again, this one does not taste young. And for the first time, I think we can actually say this isn't a young whiskey. It is a well-aged whiskey. And for me, there's a pretty large step up from the other three offerings that we've had so far.
Yeah, I will say this one definitely kind of falls out of the general flavor like wheelhouse of Broken Barrel for me. Like it's more earthy, it's more herbal, it's not that sweet. But what I really appreciated about it was that it really coats the tongue the way that a really nice sweet bourbon does. So it didn't stand out as harsh in any way. There wasn't like a ton of aggressive spice going on here. It's just more of, like I said, like a piney, woodsy taste for me. I liked this a lot, Brad. If I had to give it a score out of 10, this would be like at least a 7.5 or an 8 out of 10 for me. And that means that we have one more left to try. This is their 116 proof barrel strength version. Now, again, we're using essentially the same whiskey we used in their baseline 95 proof bourbon, but we're just upping the proof points by 21 here. So I'm interested to see what you think, Brad, if increasing the proof or, just not watering it down makes a big difference in terms of flavor for you.
The flavor is a little bit better. It's so much more viscous that I really enjoy what's going on here. It is still smooth. I think a lot of the oak comes out in this one, but there's still a little bit of youth on the flavor here that kind of detracts from the rest of the experience. It's a nice flavor. There's some classic bourbon notes. You're getting bourbon. For this one, I actually got like a little bit of brown sugar, like almost like a sugar cookie. There was some sweetness there. However, in the end, there's still a little bit of that youth, and it just takes away from the experience a little bit for me. However, as opposed to the 95, I don't think I would buy their 95 proof at any point. I'm not very impressed by it. I actually like this 115. It's something that I would be willing to give to somebody else just at any point. It's a solid offering in the 116 range.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say, again, we're going back to using 1-year-old whiskey here. So I feel like there's a ceiling on that. You know what I mean? Like you can only do so much with a whiskey that's only been aged for a year, or a blend of whiskey where the youngest is a year old. The interesting note that I got on this one, Brad, and I don't know if you picked this up at all, it has all the same kind of, general caramel vanilla notes that the 95 did. But for me, there was also like this saline kind of note undercutting it. I kept getting like almost like a brothy, like savory and saline on this as well. You're right. It had a lot of nice oak and barrel notes on the palate, and the heat really builds, and it wasn't harsh or aggressive in any way. And once again, like I've said this already, I think the great thing about this process they apply to the whiskey is that they really kind of round off the rougher edges of young whiskey. And so they take, what is essentially like our least favorite kind of whiskey to drink, and they make it into something that is legitimately enjoyable to drink.
Yeah, I mean, other than their 95 proof, I would say that I genuinely enjoyed every single whiskey they offered here. They have a variety of flavor profiles that they're going for. They mask the youngness in a really nice, smooth way. So yeah, I'm in on Broken Barrel. I think what they are offering is phenomenal. I think if they made more of their regular whiskeys with 12 and 5-year aged whiskeys, I think they'd really, really be onto something.
Yeah. So when I first went through these and I was trying to figure out okay, does this process really only work if you're using lower proof bourbons? Because you can kind of water down and round out some of those rough edges. I don't think that's true. I think they have demonstrated that with the process they use, you can use higher proof stuff here too. I think for me, at least, the thing that I really wish they would do is make higher proof versions of some of their other expressions aside from that, baseline bourbon. Like if they made a barrel strength version of the Cabernet finish, I think that would be out of this world. And going along with what you're saying, Brad, the other option is try using 4-year whiskey. Now, I don't know what that'll do to cost of production or how much it would cost on the shelf. But one of the things I appreciated that Seth told me was we have the consumer in mind here. We're only charging $30 a bottle for this stuff. And for you and me who do this podcast based almost entirely on the value of something, I really appreciate that they're going into this saying we don't want to charge exorbitant amounts of money here. But having tried their regular stuff, I would say, if they got their hands on 4-6-year-old stuff and did the same process to it, I would pay $50, $55 for a bottle of it because I know how good the 1-year stuff is at $30.
Yeah, I mean, this might be a dumb analogy, but I'll never forget my freshman year of college speech teacher. And the thing she said is, when you are giving a speech, you have to keep your audience in mind. You might be the most persuasive human being on the planet, but if you don't think about who your audience is, then it doesn't matter. And I think that I appreciate that when it comes to the whiskey world, that when you have these distillers that aren't just worried about, we're just going to make the most expensive, greatest whiskey of all time. No, we're going to think about our consumers. We're going to think about how much money they're able to pay, not just willing to pay. And I think that's what sets apart a place like Broken Barrel over some of the big places Buffalo. Anyways. I just think that what Seth is doing over at Broken Barrel is phenomenal, and I'm really thankful for distillers that think about the customer.
Yeah. So, Brad, let's go ahead and rank these according to our own preferences. I think if I was going to give my ranking, surprisingly enough, that low proof Cabernet finish would be my number one, that 88 proof. It was just phenomenal. And then I would probably say the Amontillado at 110 proof. And then I'd go barrel strength. But like you said, after that, there is kind of a major step down for me. 95 proof bourbon. And then for me, the 105 rye would be on the bottom. But especially those top two, the 88 proof Cabernet finish and the Amontillado are no-brainer recommendations for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much at the same spot as you. I just flipped the top two and flipped the bottom two. I really, really love the Cask of Amontillado. That's my top. The Cabernet finished 88 proof is my second. The 115 barrel proof is my third. And then there's a pretty big drop off to the rye at 4 and their classic bourbon offering at 5.
Well, I will say, if you see Broken Barrel on the shelf, do not hesitate to pick it up because we love what they're doing as a company. We believe in what they're doing as a company. And Brad, I think this is a good place to announce, if you've made it this far in the episode, we are going to do a giveaway. You can try all 5 of these Broken Barrel samples if you follow us on Patreon. If you're a Patreon supporter, for as little as $3 a month, you will get bonus content and access to a special Discord server. And you will be entered into a giveaway for each of these Broken Barrel samples. We'll choose one lucky winner at the end of next week, and we'll get those samples sent out. So please consider joining our Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/filmwhiskey.
Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us for this bonus episode. We are so excited to get back to our regularly scheduled content on Monday. But until then, I'm Brad G.
I'm Bob Book.
And we'll see you next time.